Okay, well, the pandemic was a crazy thing that we went through, and something else crazy has been happening because of the pandemic. What happened was people got stuck at home, and they started thinking. And they looked at their lives, and they said, I am running around like crazy, doing all kinds of things. And why am I doing that? Why is my life just so crazy? And so they started asking, why am I living this way? Why do I go to work every day and put in all these hours? And why do I spend my time the way I do? And is this worth it? Or, this being stuck at home thing, I kind of like that. I kind of like being with my family. And now that the economy is recovering a bit, they're looking at their job a little different. They're going is this really the job I want? And I've read statistics anywhere from 25% to 55% of the people have either taken a different job or are seriously considering and maybe even interviewing for a different job. That's a huge changeover. And the issues vary from person to person. It could be that maybe they're feeling frustrated with their pay and their benefits. They're frustrated with the number of hours that they're doing. They're frustrated with the culture of the business that they're in. And maybe they just want a better balance between work and family life. And so they're looking. And it's like this gigantic game of musical jobs, right? Where everybody's rotating and trying something new, looking for something better. And the funny thing is, someone left that job because they didn't like it, and someone else is looking at that job because they think it's going to be better. And we're just trying to figure all that out, aren't we? And it does have business owners and managers asking the question of how do we retain our employees? And how do we find new employees that are going to fill in? Because their struggle is that they need a certain level of efficiency in order to make their business run. And they're looking for qualified people who are going to actually show up for work and do the work. And they're wondering, how much money do I give people? How many benefits do I give people in order to keep this job filled and yet be profitable so that I don't have to shut down? So on the one side, you have employees that are frustrated, and they're saying that they've had enough, and they feel like they've been taken advantage of, and they see their business owner as being too demanding, and they want a better life. And then on the other hand, you have these businessmen who are going okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to find employees that will show up? They'll do the job, and they'll be qualified for it. And how am I going to keep my business running? Because I have other competitors who, if I drive down my profits anymore, I'm not going to be a business. So there's this whole tug-of-war thing happening between employees and employers as to where these lines should be. Now, this tug-of-war isn't something new. This has gone way back. And in fact, the Apostle Paul is actually writing about that in Ephesians. And so we're going to be looking at that. We're in Ephesians chapter 6. We'll start at verse 5. And I encourage you to find these verses because it really fits the situation that we're in. Now, the Apostle Paul is going to help us understand how the renewed life affects our business relationships and our work life. My dad owned a service master. When they started, it was just my mom and dad working together as a team, going out and cleaning homes and businesses. And by the time they were done, I think it was somewhere around 20 employees that they had, doing everything from, cleaning in the evening to carpets to cleaning up after disasters, whether it be water in your basement or a fire that needs to be cleaned up. And I remember them as a teen having conversations about, what is this balance? How much do we pay our employees? How many benefits do we give our employees? How much can we share and still be profitable and run a business? And that was a struggle that they really wrestled through. And it's not easy. And so this Renew series, as I look at it, is all about how when we take on this new life, this new perspective of God transforming us, how do we as in our work life, either as a manager or as an employee, where's that balance and what does that look like? And that's in essence what the Apostle Paul is talking about here. So let's read it and then we'll kind of walk our way through it and talk about it. Ephesians, chapter 6, starting at verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Now, as I read this, my thought was, well, this kind of doesn't apply because we don't have slaves. Although some of you would say, oh, yes, there are, right? Sometimes you feel like a slave, maybe. But the concept of slavery in that day was actually fairly close to the concept of employment that we have today. So slaves were extremely common during that time. Some of it was that the Romans had gone in and conquered all these other areas, and then they would take this whole group of slaves back with them, and they would sell them off to various people who would use them as employees, or even as kind of machines in their shop, whatever they were producing. So we have these employees, and we have machines that do all the work. Well, they had slaves, and they would purchase them, and then they would put them in their businesses. But in a lot of ways, these slaves functioned similar to what we would call employees today. Now, the issue here is that these slaves had drastically different experiences because they had no rights. So you might have one slave who works in this depths of this mine somewhere, and they're out digging down in some dangerous area that's going to deeply affect their lifestyle, their physical health, and shorten their life. And it's miserable. But then you have other slaves who might work for a government official who lives in this extravagant place. And this slave might actually live a better lifestyle than the average person in everyday life. And so you have these wildly different lives that these slaves were living. And then one slave owner might be a reasonable person who treats their employees or their slaves with respect. And then you might have another slave owner who's a tyrant and beats their slaves and treats them in inhumane ways. So no matter whether the slaves were treated well or not, the owners ran in different circles, social circles, than the slaves. The slaves would go to live in the poor section of town, and the owners would live in extravagance a lot of times, and they lived fairly happy. Now, this is where the church was extremely unique, because the Christian church did this amazing thing. They mixed slave owners with slaves in the same church. And the rest of society saw this and was just bamboozled by this mix. And slave owners and slaves got along and liked each other and supported each other and pooled their resources. And the society of that day was like, what in the world is this? And in fact, this is what the Apostle Paul writes to the Colossians. Colossians 3:11 says, "Here there is no Gentile or Jew, there's no circumcised or uncircumcised, there's no barbarian or Scythian or slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all." So there's this mix of people who are from completely different backgrounds, completely different social circles, completely different economic situations, all hanging out together and loving each other. And the society was like, what in the world is this? And yet it worked. Now, here's what I noticed about what's going on in Ephesians. Starting at Ephesians 5:22, and that's right where the Apostle Paul starts talking to husbands and wives, and then he starts talking to fathers and children, and now he's talking to slave owners and slaves. And in that whole section, he is covering all of our primary relationships that we run into in everyday life. When we're just doing life, we interact between husband and wife, we interact with our children, and we interact at work. And so he's covering the whole section. And this is what's really interesting to me, is that in each one of the sections, the first person that he talks to is always the person who is powerless. He starts with wives instead of husbands. He starts with children instead of fathers. He starts with slaves instead of masters. Isn't that interesting? And he challenges them each first, and then he challenges the one who's more powerful second. And then what he does with each side is he gives them a challenge that is ridiculous. Wives, submit to your husbands. Well, that's ridiculous. Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. That's ridiculous. And then he shifts to children. Submit to your parents or submit to your fathers. What? No, I want to be independent. Fathers, don't exasperate your children. And he says that to a society where fathers could literally just have their children executed if they wanted. And now he's going to challenge these guys to do something absolutely ridiculous. So let's go back to verse 5. So the Apostle Paul challenges them by saying, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are a slave or free." And so now I want you just to kind of do a mental transport. Go back 2,000 years. And let's just say that you are a slave and you've been working out in the field. You've been picking grapes and you're working hard and you have no rights, and so you can't demand time off. And so you're hoping that your slave owner will give you the freedom to go to church. And so you ask him, and And sometimes this guy is harsh and cruel and driven, and other times he's giving and kind. And let's just say that, you know what? He actually lets you go to church because you don't have any rights. You can't demand it. He can do anything to you he wants. Now, because you have no rights, you feel like a nobody. I mean, you're a thing. You're not a person. At least that's the way he treats you. You don't have inalienable rights. You, you have alien rights, which is zero. And that's why Christianity was so attractive to you. Because when you learned about Christianity, you learned about a God who valued you as a person, loved who you were. In fact, this God loved you so much that he would give his own son to have you back. And that's just a concept that you had never heard before. You've learned that God created you as a special person, that God sent his son to substitute for you, that God invited you into his family and seated you in the heavenlies beside Christ. And then God gave you the keys to the kingdom, and that someday you would live in his presence. And that's just like, wow. And so that's what really attracted you to Christianity. So then, the reader who is at the church says, I have this letter that comes from this great teacher, and this teacher is one of the great leaders of Christianity. He wrote us a letter, and I'm going to read it to you. And then when he gets to the part where he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, and follow him like you would obey Christ, and even serve your master with all your heart. Can you imagine what's going through this guy's head? What? That's ridiculous. Why would you demand that I treat this bully, this selfish, arrogant person? Why would I love and honor him? Why would I work hard for this guy? And this slave is thinking to himself, wow, if I'm going to do this changes everything about my attitude and everything about how I do work. And am I willing to actually act that way with this guy after he's treated me like this? And then this slave is at church, and across the room is this guy who owns slaves. I mean, this guy is rich. This guy has slaves to serve him lunch, for goodness sake. And he has more money than he knows what to do with. And it's a little weird at times at church because you come from this completely different situation than him. And yet he treats you kind, and you've talked, and he doesn't treat you like a nobody. But still, like, how do we mix together and how do we do all this? And as you look across the room, as the reader is reading this letter and it's talking about slaves serve wholeheartedly, he's like, yeah, he's all in. But the reader keeps reading, and then he gets to verse 9, and it says, masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Don't threaten them, because you know that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and there's no favoritism with him. And this slave owner, cocks his head to the side, and he starts thinking, and he's going like, what does the Apostle Paul mean by that? Because the Apostle Paul says, treat your slaves in the same way. The same way as what? Like, Paul challenged these guys to obey. So, as a slave owner, am I supposed to obey my slaves? Like, how does that work? Or maybe Paul is talking about the concept of respect with fear and sincerity, and that I'm supposed to, in a way, fear my slaves. That I'm supposed to respect them and have this sincerity of service to them. Wow, okay, and he's trying to wrap his mind around this. What does this mean? Because he's thinking, if I show weakness, they'll just run right over the top of me. How do you treat your slaves with respect and fear and sincerely care about these people when these guys, they're selfish and they're lazy? If you don't push them, they'll do nothing. And so he's wrestling with this. And then the Apostle Paul reminds this slave owner that God is the master of everyone. And yet, out of his great love, even though he's the master and owner of everything, and he could demand that we follow him, instead what God did is sent his own son to serve us, to set us free, to show this sincere love. And so now, this slave owner is asking himself, what does this look like? How do I do this? And after contemplating this for a while, this rich slave owner looks around the room and he notices the slave across the room in his church. And over time, he's thinking I've gotten to know this guy, and I really do love him, and I do at times, in some ways, support him, at least emotionally, if not financially. And if I start applying that in my business, I wonder what that looks like and how we can make that work. But one thing he's confident of is, boy, this is going to change everything if I apply this. Now, here's what we modern day people wonder about these verses. The question is, why didn't the Apostle Paul just tell all the slave owners who are Christian, set these people free? Why would he even allow Christians to own other people? And let me tell you, the scholars have wrestled with this and really talked about it, and there's a couple conclusions that they've made. And first of all, if the Apostle Paul would have demanded that these slave owners release these people, it would have broken both the slave owners and the slaves. And here's why. Because when you set all these people free, and you say, you don't have to work for me anymore, they have to find a job in a market where slaves are very cheap and easy to get. And the owners now have to try to hire someone in their place, and they're going to go bankrupt, and so the economy collapse is going to be massive. And in fact, what we don't talk about is that when Abraham Lincoln set the slaves free in the South, a lot of slaves just continued to live the way they did because they had nowhere to go. There was no way for them to get employment. So they were like, if you'll just keep me on, I'll just keep working and we'll just kind of keep things the same. And so that happened in the South when the slaves were set free. Now, the second aspect of this is that technically slavery isn't the issue. And you go like, what? Well, see, the real issue that drives slavery is that really it's a lack of respect and love for other people. That's the issue. The issue is that I can see you as a thing, a machine. something to do my will, so that makes you less than me instead of equal with me. And as soon as I can put you in that picture, I can treat you however I want, and it doesn't matter. If you take that away, slavery falls apart. It just does. And so as Christianity spread throughout Europe, slavery fell apart. Because suddenly people started treating each other with this sense of respect and honor. And how do you have slaves when you love and respect each other? So what happened was that the Apostle Paul knew what he was doing. He understood the underlying issue, and that by loving and respecting each other, the whole slavery thing was going to disappear. Now, that led to a society where people were hired to do the work and treated on a more equal basis. And in America, it's that whole thing of, do we love and respect each other enough to treat each other well, or do we see each other as lower than, and therefore we can treat them however we want? And here's what's happening a bit in the U.S. In our drive to make more money, each of us, whether we be employees or owners and managers, we see each other as things instead of people. Owners see employees as a way to make money. And employees see owners as a way to make money. And we treat each other that way. In other words, we've dehumanized each other so that we can be manipulative with each other and be okay with it. And so these verses apply to us in the exact same way that they applied in that day. So let's ask ourselves the key questions. If I'm an employee, how do I view my boss? How do I view the business that I work for? Have I dehumanized the business so that I feel okay milking them for every dime I can? To play a game where I can, be lazy and shortchange the work that I'm supposed to do because, they don't pay me enough anyway, and so I'm just going to do this job halfway and see what I can get out of it. Right? And so the Apostle Paul would say to those who are employees, obey your boss with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart. Do it in the exact same way that you would work for Jesus. And obey them, not only to look good when they're watching, but do it when they're not watching, and be employees of Christ. Do the will of God because you know that the Lord is watching, and whatever good you do, whether you're a slave or free, do it for him because you know that he's watching. Okay, so then let's flip it on the other side. How do I view my employees? Because business owners, or people who manage others, we can dehumanize other people and look at them as though they're things to produce money for us, and end up treating them with contempt rather than honor. Sometimes business owners even use intimidation to motivate others, and they demand from others, and they're aggressive because we see them simply as machines to get done what we want so that we can make money. And to them, the Apostle Paul would say, business leaders and managers, treat your employees like they're real people. Treat them with respect. Treat them with honor and love. Don't use threats. Don't intimidate them to motivate them. But because you know that Jesus is your boss, you should never treat them the way Jesus wouldn't treat you. Now, just think of what would happen to our society overall if everyone had that attitude, where employees were faithful and served their place of business faithfully, and employers paid their employees so that they could live. Wouldn't that be just a nice place to live? Well, we can't control all of society, but we can live it ourselves, right? We can take that attitude into our business wherever we go, whether we're an employee or a manager, and treat people with honor wherever we go. And I think to myself about our value, we call it Jesus first. And when we're going to put Jesus first, it means that every interaction and everything we do is as though we are serving Jesus because he is first in our life. It isn't about how much money we make. It isn't about all the benefits that we're getting. It isn't about what car we drive or what house we have. It's about Jesus first. And when we take that mentality wherever we go, we begin to not only renew our lives, but we become a statement to the whole world, and we renew our society. And so I'm going to give you just a minute to bow your head, talk to Jesus about your situation, and interact with him about what it means to put Jesus first where you work and what you do and how you treat the people around you. Use this time for quiet contemplation, and then we'll go into our last song.